So the vast majority of exercise science peer-reviewed literature shows that single set training is better than multiple set training for muscle growth or muscle hypertrophy. I know this is going to ruffle a lot of feathers because a lot of people for some reason have an emotional attachment to multiple set training, probably because they've been doing it for so long. But whether you like it or not, the research overwhelmingly shows that single set training is better, or in worst case scenario, exactly the same in terms of stimulating muscle growth. Don't believe me? Well, I'm going to go over some research to prove it. I'm going to go over a study that was done by James Fisher and James Steele, both PhDs in exercise science, where they looked at over 130 peer-reviewed exercise literature to come up with some what they refer to as evidence-based recommendations for muscle hypertrophy. What they found after going over 130 peer-reviewed exercise literature papers was that single set training is optimal. So I'm going to go over the paper published in 2013 by James Fisher and James Steele. And I'm also going to go over a couple of studies that they looked at and dissected when they came up with the evidence that single set training is superior. So this is the study titled Evidence-Based Resistance Training Recommendations for Muscular Hypertrophy, or if those of you who are unfamiliar with the term muscular hypertrophy, that just means muscular growth. The study was performed by James Fisher, James Steele, and Dave Smith, all PhDs in exercise science from the UK. So let's just briefly look at the conclusions quickly. What they found was evidence supports that persons should train to the highest intensity of effort, or in other words, to muscular failure, which recruits as many motor units and muscle fibers as possible. They should self-select a load and repetition range, so what they found through the research was that load and repetition range doesn't really make a difference. And they found that individuals should perform single sets for each exercise. Now this may blow a lot of people's minds because most people in the gym and most bodybuilders are performing multiple sets. In a later video, I'm going to go over the reason why that is, and it has to do with a huge critical thinking error and a lot to do with the DeLorme-Watkins protocol, some books published by Reg Park back in the 60s, and of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So the conclusion was that individuals should perform single sets of high-intensity effort to failure. And based off of over 130 peer-reviewed exercise science papers, that's what they found to be the recommendation for optimizing muscle hypertrophy. So let's dissect a couple of these studies and see what they found. So if you go towards the bottom of this research paper, you're going to see that the supporting articles that they used are separated into categories conveniently so we can look at the studies ourselves. We're going to look at the category volume and frequency. What they found was, based on the recommendation, single set training appears to provide similar hypertrophic gains to multiple set training. So this is the first study that they referenced, or the articles that they looked at in terms of volume and frequency for optimal muscle growth. This study is titled Effective Resistance Training Volume on Strength and Muscle Thickness by D.B. Starkley and others. See if we can find a date here, 1996. So they went way back. They compiled all of the peer-reviewed exercise science literature. And this is just the first study I'm going over here. I didn't pick this for any other particular reason other than it was the first one listed. The purpose of this study was to determine the effects of different volumes of high-intensity resistance training on isometric torque, or in other words, muscle torque or muscle strength, and muscle thickness, aka muscle growth. Training was conducted 3 times per week using 1 set, low volume, or 3 sets, high volume, of dynamic variable resistance exercise, basically meaning lifting and lowering the weight with resistance. 10 subjects acted as non-training controls. Bilateral knee extension, or leg extension as people commonly refer to, and knee flexion, or leg curl, exercise was performed to fatigue, or muscle failure, within 8 to 12 repetitions for 14 weeks. Maximal isometric knee extension and knee flexion torque was tested at 6 degrees, 24 degrees, 42 degrees, 60, etc., using a MedX knee extension and knee flexion machine. The anterior, lateral, and posterior right thigh, the medialis muscle, and the lateralis muscle were assessed for thickness by B-mode ultrasound. Both training groups improved torque output at most angles, but there was no difference between the group that performed 1 set versus the group that performed 3 sets in terms of improvements in muscle strength. Ultrasound detected increases in muscle thickness for the group that performed 1 set at 60%, 40%, and 60% increases. The group that performed 3 sets increased muscle thickness, again, at 40% and 60%. Exactly the same. In conclusion, 1 set of high-intensity resistance training was as effective as 3 sets for increasing the strength and muscle thickness of the knee extenders, and the knee flexors. So that's just the first of several studies that were looked at and dissected to find what the evidence shows is the optimal way to train for improvements in muscle strength and muscle size. And what that study found was there's literally no difference at all whatsoever performing 1 set versus the commonly accepted 3 sets in terms of stimulating improvements in muscle strength and muscle growth. In a later video, I'm going to go over some other studies. But in order to keep this one short, I'm just going over the first study that they included out of over 130 peer-reviewed scientific literature